Sure. Yeah, we're still waiting for Dan.
Streaming is on.
Hey, Dan.
Greetings.
Oh.
I've got one minor chore to do, which probably won't take longer than when we wait for people to come in. I'll be right back.
Sure. Okay.
do this.
Morning.
Hey there. Greetings.
Hey. Cheers.
Cheers.
We have a light crew today.
Yeah, I guess we had 16 signups.
Uh-huh. Oh, we can give them a few more minutes. Frozen fish sticks don't quite count, but I'm doing my best to emulate the pub fish and chips.
Well, shall we kick things off?
Sure.
Yeah, welcome everyone
Yeah.
to California Smalltalkers for July 2022. I'm Craig Latta, and I'm joined by Dan Ingalls, who's going to pitch us an idea called Squeak Pages. But before we do that, if anyone has a lightning talk they'd like to give, just like a 5 minutes or less description of what you've been working on lately, we'd all love to hear it.
Sure, I'll go.
Okay.
It's actually more something that I'm starting to do rather than something that I'm doing, but let me see here.
That's the fun time to talk about it.
Yeah, it's before it gets hard and boring.
Well, and then plus we can join your thrill of success as it gradually unfolds.
All right, I was just running the infamous benchmarks to compare this is Squeak 6.0 beta image, and I was trying to see the benchmark compared to Squeak.js on the same machine on Firefox and Chrome OS. So yeah, so the native performance with COG is 2.7 billion bytecodes per second, 240 million cents per second. And the two browsers gave me more or less the same result, about 1/20th of the bytecodes per second and 1/200th of the cents per second, which is reasonable. I mean, this benchmark really doesn't mean that much. No, so when I started to take the Smalltalk computer project more seriously in 1984, I was interested in the fact that the Blue Book virtual machine wasn't written in an object-oriented way, and of course it was done that way on purpose so you could translate it to Pascal or C. It's something that I actually did, and now we have the slang translator, so we get all this technology. But I wondered if there wasn't a way to do an object-oriented virtual machine. So I didn't have a running Smalltalk at the time, so that's what I sat down and wrote it on paper, an object-oriented virtual machine, which I lately call clone reduce. And it stayed in paper until about 95 when I created my website. Then I typed it into a text file and put it there. But it has never been tested. It has never been run. So let me push this out of the way. So this is the text that's been there. So it's just a text, and it's in fact not completely valid. Smalltalk, for example, I didn't have a left arrow character, so I did a bunch of stuff that. So what I've done so far is to just make enough changes so that this can be filed into Squeak. So, for example, I use a bunch of the same name of classes like context. Obviously, that doesn't work. So I replaced it with CR, clone reduce context. So I have three main classes. I have a template class, and the template is an object that represents a message sent in the source code. And there are several subclasses of that. It's specialized. And the idea of the clone is that you start out with your code. This is kind of small, right? So it's not going to become, it's a bitmap, so it's not going to become. Okay, so this is an expression.
It's a morph, right? You can use the halo to scale it.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to do.
Oh, it doesn't want to.
Doesn't want to resize.
If you go over to the rotate handle and.
Oh yeah. Sorry. Rotate it first. Yeah, that'll work. Even if you just rotate it and then rotate it back, you'll still be left with this wrapper that will.
Maybe.
And then to the yellow thing. Oh, dang.
No, it hasn't. You haven't rotated it yet, or maybe.
Oh, you didn't rotate it? Yeah.
No, I think I tried, but okay. Now.
We'll see.
Yeah. Nice.
Good idea. So I took this expression here, it's the left side here. So minimum point receives origin minimum rectangle origin. It's the example that's in the blue book, which shows them how this becomes the bytecodes. So I created these templates. So the method is represented as a block that has two temporary variables, and then it has an array of expressions, just one in this case. And then, so this is actually is pretty bad because I create these literal templates all the time. This was the very first Smalltalk program I ever wrote. And since I never ran it, I never debugged it, I never fixed it. So it's not very good. But that's the idea. You take this source code here and you generate this huge array of objects, these template objects. And the big idea was to run this, you basically clone this tree. For every template, eventually you get a little context object later on when you actually send the message. And there are two versions. One that I actually wrote down, which I called the lazy clone reduce. The contexts are created on demand. So that's what this code here does. The interpreter is sequential. It has current context and index. This is the equivalent of the program counter. And it steps through the tree, converting every template into a context. So, and that's the clone phase. And then there's the reduce phase where the leaves of the tree become messages that get sent. And eventually that a template is replaced by the result of executing that message. So the tree shrinks. So in the clone phase, the tree grows and grows, and then in the reduce phase, it shrinks. So the idea is that you do stuff. The main method is this sender context one index max lex, and every subclass will do something different from this. So I replaced the case statement that you have, for example, in the Lisp interpreter, famous Lisp 1.5 interpreter. You have two case statements: the eval and apply. They both are implemented in the form of case statements. And here, instead, you send the sender index max lex, and each node will do something slightly different. It will so for the block, we'll create a block context. The super block will create a super context, and so on. And yeah, so it's not very much code, and I haven't finished fixing. Like I said, I just patched it enough that I can load it in. And now the next step is in the interpreter to step. No. Oh, here it is. Yeah, the interpreter, it has a cache. So the next step is to, every time the cache doesn't find a method in itself, it will take the source code from the underlying Squeak image and will create the tree. So that's the next step I'm going to use the compiler classes that's already in Squeak, but steps through it to create those templates, and then now have the class, the selector, and the template tree. And then see if interpret. So the idea is that this lazy sequential one should be able to execute any Squeak expression that doesn't include fork and perform. I'm not going to implement those, at least not initially. So anything that doesn't use perform, then I'll be able to execute it, and it should give me the same result. And then I'll do the eager clone reduce, which evaluates all the leaves of the tree as a single step. So it'll do that in parallel, but that won't be perfectly, won't be the same. Let's see here. It won't be necessarily the same semantics. So some interleave execution that shouldn't be interleaved. So that's the problem when you try to parallelize Squeak. Some things work, some things don't work. So that's the goal, to see if this code from 1984 can be fixed and can work, and if this is a computational model that makes any sense.
That's cool.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. Does someone else have?
Do you have a picture of what you want to do with this to test it out, or compare it with other things?
Well, yeah. So the initial idea is just to be able to type a simple expression in Squeak, and then I'm going to create a morph to show this tree, like the picture that I drew. So I'm going to have two morphs. One to show what's inside the cache, the trees that have been translated from source, and the other one, the evaluation tree. So I'm just going to see, the idea is just to see if this idea still makes sense. If it all works, then eventually, but this is more research, more for the future, eventually then we can have a hardware implementation of this non-von Neumann computer executing Smalltalk or whatever. That's for the future. Just first have to check, because it seems silly to have this code, that it's been out there for decades and decades, and never. Now that I have running Smalltalk, that's silly not to try it to see if it works.
Right.
You hear me?
Yes.
I'm running sort of the opposite end of the world. So the cell is doing this very interesting theoretical template version of this, and I'm trying to build a more modern production quality Smalltalk system. And so I have some ideas on dispatch and so on and so forth. But as I've been working on it, I've started to realize that this could actually be the basis for many dynamic languages. So the Open Smalltalk VM supports Newspeak as well as various Smalltalk dialects. So I started thinking about, so I'm going to have, like a production quality garbage collector, a very good way of handling immediate values, dispatch. And so I'm thinking that you could build basically all these pieces, you could sort of plug them together with a parser scanner and produce a Python runtime environment, or a Ruby runtime environment, or a Scheme runtime environment. I don't know how to do call with current continuation yet, but apart from that, most of the rest would work fairly well. So anyway, I wrote a paper that probably won't be accepted, because as I was writing the paper, I was thinking about all these things, and some pieces of it have come together in my head since the paper. But anyway, so this idea of having a pluggable dynamic environment, dynamic programming environment that you could build up language of your choice. And this could be really interesting, because you could sort of get the Smalltalk development environment and Python code, or and get the Python sort of infinite plugins that access all the whole world, and write in Smalltalk. So this idea that you could have a multilingual environment that would support our favorite language and also code written in other languages, and ideally even to the point of when you open a debugger, you could choose, oh, I'd like to debug this in Python or Smalltalk or whatever. So anyway, that's I've been working on the Smalltalk environment, and just when I wrote this paper, I started thinking about all the ways that this could become a sort of a pluggable system that could really maybe I mean, probably it'll die an academic death, but if it doesn't, it could actually be a way for dynamic languages to gain some foothold in the sort of production world. So completely opposite from what Giselle is doing, but we'll see.
That's sort of what Ian Marta wanted with his COLA system. I don't know if you looked at that. Yeah, he wanted his COLA was combined object lambda something. What's the A? I don't remember. But or LA is language. But no. But anyway, he tried to make everything as pluggable. He wanted to see how little code you could have, and then everything would be pluggable into it. And there are some Java people who want parts of it to be pluggable. I know that the JDK9, I forgot the name. There's this Java thing where the garbage collector is completely pluggable, so they have a framework. They want to be able to have a garbage collector that you write, and then all the VMs would be able to use it. They want to have a standard interface between the garbage collector and the rest of the VM. And then there's the Growl people. It's not that it's pluggable, it's that they created a consistent environment, so that you can have two windows, this one with Python code, this one with Smalltalk code, and this one with Java code, and have your application have these pieces work together. It's called Polyglot on Growl. So it's interesting as an inspiration, you might find that interesting.
Yeah, I'll look at that. If you had any pointers to this COLA, because COLA, I suspect, doesn't Google very well.
Yes.
Yeah, if you go to the vpri.org site and see our writings, and you look at what Ian Marta wrote, so most of the material is there.
Okay.
Yeah, he actually used other names like Pepsi. One of his programs, the Smalltalk on top of COLA was called Pepsi or stuff like that. That really makes it hard to search on Google. Yeah.
Yep. But his last name makes it easier.
Yeah.
Well, if you can spell it right.
Yes.
I'd always get it wrong.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, if I could go a second time, just for a few seconds, I mentioned that this week I spent most of it trying to see if 8-bit Squeak would be viable. But I'm not sure it can. I'm trying to raise some statistics about how many objects and how many references each object has and stuff like that. And don't know if the idea was to see if I could run it on the RP2040 Raspberry Pi microcontroller that has 240 kilobytes of RAM and an external flash.
So a pointer is 8 bits, and you have then tables for pointing from one object to another?
Yeah, actually it's six bits plus 2 bits of tag.
Mm-hmm.
So you have 4 kinds. You have local objects that are in the same group.
Yeah.
You have global objects, that popular objects that everybody points to. You have a small integer, which can be from -32 to +31. And what's the other one? Oh, remote objects. Yeah, so remote objects point to a export table, and then you have a larger pointer. So depending on the ratio of local to remote objects, it actually doesn't compress anything compared to 16-bit. So, because remote pointers, since you have this 8-bit thing pointing to a table that has a 16-bit entry, it's actually a 24-bit pointer. So some of the pointers are 8-bit, some are 24-bit. So depending on the ratio, you actually lose out. So I'm not sure. I haven't convinced myself that it would work. But the idea is then you have these little groups of up to 64 objects living on the flash memory, and you can swap in up to 1024 of those between that more or less fits 240 kilobytes. Well, you still have to have code for the VM or something like that. But so you'd be swapping out these segments from the RAM to the flash. But yeah, an alternative is to use 32-bit pointers in some compression scheme. That might actually end up with a smaller average pointer than this elaborate scheme. But
well, some of these things you actually just have to try out some simple thing, and it's not always easy, but yeah. Got any other announcements or little lightning talks? Yes, one. We just got to get you unmuted.
Yeah. Do you see the Juan? Do you see the row of buttons along the bottom? There's a little microphone. I'll mention in passing that I'm writing a transpiler from Smalltalk compiled methods to WebAssembly. That should be fun.
Yeah.
Using the epigram framework I mentioned last month.
Looks like
we lost him.
I think he's gonna
try back.
Try another run at the fence.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Apologies, I had to switch browser and use Chrome instead of Firefox, whatever. I just want to take the opportunity to tell you a little bit of news in quiz. I already shown, and most of you, I believe, have seen the vector graphic stuff and zoomable morphic pixel independent mode, the true type with Unicode glyphs rasterization. And the news is that in the last few months, I worked on the text editors. So now we have a full Unicode text editors. And also I used a UTF-8 representation for Unicode strings. This is quite different from what Squeak does. And also UTF-8 files. So, and I also took the Unicode character attributes database. I don't remember the name. So quiz is a letter or a mathematical symbol. So now you write Smalltalk code in any alphabet and with binary selectors made up of any Unicode mathematical symbol. So this opens new possibilities, especially for people who like APL, for example. So it's a lot of fun. And code can be saved to the sources and changed. And everything seems to work quite well. When I implemented TrueType and TrueType rasterization in vector graphics, instead of using a huge array of glyphs, I used the UTF-8 structure as the data structure to the Bezier information for the TrueType glyph. It's very fast because I have a UTF-8 string and I iterate over the bytes and use those bytes as indexes in arrays that are up to 256 entries maximum. Grab the next byte in UTF-8 and index the next array. So I don't need to do any conversion between encodings. And I can just read the bytes from the file and give them to the vector graphics engine, and it just iterates the bytes and rasterizes everything. So it's extremely fast and quite memory efficient. That, of course, is thanks to the people who designed UTF-8. Very clever. So I just took advantage of that in my own data, and it works quite well. And maybe you will want to try this with the official Open Smalltalk VM. The latest quiz, you select in the world menu, install the updates, and preferences, use UTF-8. Everything will work. You can copy and paste stuff from web pages or operating system in UTF-8 in any alphabet, and there are several TrueTypes included in our repo, including one for and another one that covers every Western language, and one for Egyptian hieroglyphs that also work perfectly well. So maybe you want to have some fun with that.
That's great.
Oh, cool. Christian, you raised your hand.
Okay. So I just, I don't know, some of you know that I port the PDF framework to the other Squeaks, to the other Smalltalks. And one part of the PDF stuff is PostScript interpreter. So I wrote a little PostScript interpreter. Unfortunately, the reason why I wrote it is going to be obsolete. Adobe just announced that Type 1 fonts will be obsolete by next year. Too bad. So the reason I wrote this PostScript, so PostScript interpreter, it doesn't do any graphics, right? It's just a language. So just a stack language, like, yeah, Forth. And Juan might be interested in that. So the PostScript part is very simple, doesn't depend on much external libraries or whatever. So that will be ported very soon, and then you can have PostScript. Why did I need it? There are special encodings in PostScript called CMAPs in PDF. CMAPs are used for Asian languages. You can express UTF-8 very nicely in 3 lines. Very nice encoding scheme. So, but this is PostScript code. So, and I hate doing shortcuts, like assuming some kind of format where some generator generated PostScript. So the only sure way to execute it, to do that, is to write a PostScript interpreter and interpret this stuff. The same goes for Type 1 fonts. These are actually PostScript programs. So to actually make sure I can process one, I need to have a valid PostScript interpreter. So, and I can do that. Yeah, I can read PostScript Type 1 fonts natively by my PDF library. So, Juan, maybe you can take the Bezier curves and print it right away. Okay, so it's soon finished, and I will put up a notice in Squeak when the PostScript part is running. I don't know if anybody of you is still interested in this old kind of stuff, but I still like it. So, okay, that was it.
I just mentioned that even if Adobe declares that it's obsolete, there's still many papers out there that are .ps, .gz, or .z or something like that. I still run across them at least once a week.
Yeah, no, I think making that obsolete is a wish. I don't know. Maybe in 20 years they will vanish. No, they are around a lot. Yeah. In the PDFs you see also a lot of Type 1 fonts. Yeah.
Any other comments or announcements? Well, the topic that Craig and I discussed and that we put on the meeting is it can be pretty brief, but I can tell you how it started for me. The thing that I always loved about the Lively kernel, and it was actually sort of the first thing that I wanted to be able to do with it, is to just save a world as a web page. You know, you make a little drawing and make it animate something, and then you save it as a web page, and now you can send it to your girlfriend or whatever you want to do. And that's been really nice. And I would say that that's sort of largely responsible for the immediacy of that environment. In addition to, I guess, the work that Robert and Jens did on the parts bin, which just makes it really easy to publish components, which basically morphs, and pull them out and use them and write code for them. So it occurred to me, well, geez, why can't you just do that in Smalltalk? And there are reasons for it if you need the native interpreter for Smalltalk. But now with Squeak.js, it becomes much easier to do the kind of thing that Lively kernel does, which Lively kernel just stores, references into its library plus a serialization of the current world. And that's all you need. And that can all be rendered in HTML, either directly or as links. And it occurred to me that could you could just do that with Squeak.js. And Craig, I think we were chatting about this, and he knows enough of the internals of Squeak.js to realize it should be easy, because basically Smalltalk itself already knows how to serialize its worlds. And now you can just link to the Squeak.js interpreter to run it, or system actually, with the library and all. So I thought that might be fun to do, and might create a nice motivating Smalltalk environment that you could run on any pad, that kind of thing. And that's that's always been one of the things. I mean, there's all different kinds of programming that I like, but I would say the part that gives me the most pleasure is just getting an idea and doing something quick on a pad or a phone or something like that, and A, see the results, and B, send the results to somebody. And this would be a component for doing that. And we thought that in this community, if we just chatted this up a bit, we might either get some help or get some other good ideas, or at least a little bit of resonance in the room. Craig, do you want to add some to that?
Sure. Yeah, and thinking about first steps of doing this, the first thing that occurs to me is most of the audience for this, who would be visiting that web page, probably wouldn't have already run Squeak.js ever before. So we sort of have the option. We kind of have three options. We could serialize worlds, which is more useful if you've already got a Squeak image lying around. Or the second thing we could do is just make an entire object memory snapshot that has your stuff in it, and that's what gets started up by the person looking at it. And the third is another option, if they've already got a Squeak image around, is some way of connecting to running systems together and making them synchronize themselves live. And I think all three of those things are interesting to do for different use cases. Use cases and/or constraints. You might have the constraint that you want to be able to support a lot of people sharing their work, but you don't have a ton of space to save their work. So serialized worlds might be smaller and nicer than a whole bunch of entire object memory snapshots. So that, for example, that's one constraint that might make the serialized worlds more attractive. And then, yeah, depending on your use case, each of these three things have different disadvantages you might want to avoid. Like, again, with serialized worlds, you are serializing, lots of assets, classes and compiled methods and media, pictures. But unless we put some more smarts into how that works now, the person loading it won't end up with all of the processes you had running when you did your snapshot with all the program counters in the right place. I mean, that's something you could get with one of the other two approaches, making an entire object memory snapshot or synchronization. For most projects, that's not really a big deal, but I could imagine that there could be some projects where you want to really faithfully recreate the state of my machine on your machine. So those are the first things that came to mind for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Besides, if you go the serialized approach, you need to check in some way that the image that will load the project is compatible in some way the image that saves it, right?
Yeah. I think over time, that's probably the biggest problem with the serialized worlds. And the other two approaches don't have that problem. Either you can just give them an entire system so there's nothing to synchronize, or you can have some kind of synchronization behavior that can at least tell that the receiving system is not compatible and cannot be made compatible, so you can know to just give up. But I've never seen that happen. It's always possible to, bring in whatever prerequisites are needed to make the ultimate thing work. I guess if you were using a different instruction set that the other system, is on a native VM and there's no way to patch it, then you could be stuck.
So the synchronization thing, right? This sounds a bit like what the Croquet folks are doing, right? They're now doing this in JavaScript and sort of, again, there's a whole world there of how you synchronize things. They have this real-time only synchronization, which means that you have to be online to actually make it work. And then there are people working on synchronization schemes which are asynchronous, where you can save something somewhere and then come back and sync up to it. And it's fairly deep stuff to actually get it to work in the general case. I think the serialized worlds is something that's almost ready to go, I assume.
Yes.
And would be a very immediate thing that you guys could do.
Yep.
Yeah, one frustrating thing with Squeak segments is you download it and then it says, what's the modern version of this class name? I mean, at this point, what tool do I have to find out the answer and to continue from that point? And normally I abort at that point. So the solution to that would be to have some centralized dictionary. So if the system, instead of asking me, if there was a website that it could ask, what do I replace that class to and update it without asking me, that would solve it. It's like in Linux, when you're frustrated, you try to run this program and it tries to call a library and you don't have it. Okay, but you can't load the library. You have to load a package that happens to include that library. So then you Google it. And fortunately, some people have created such repositories where you find what weird RPM or .deb file includes the library that this program is trying to call, because just knowing what library the Linux program is trying to call doesn't help you. You have to know what package to load. Yeah, so now this has all been done manually as far as I know, but you have this mapping here. Given this library, what's the package in now I asked Google, but if you have some convention like Squeak map or something like that, so it could solve it, but you need this slight external infrastructure
Right.
for you to adapt to these things. So if as soon as the program hits the block, there's this website. But websites break as well because you're trying to use what's Quick Source 3 or whatever, but no, that's not what the name is. Now the website has changed the name, so it's not easy. It's a very hard problem.
Yeah, that's why no matter how we do it, I think the current croquet would fit in, would be useful for a few things anyway, for discovery, both of other people who might be using this stuff at the same time and you could collaborate with them somehow, and of metadata like what you're talking about, how to map old classes to new ones and so on. Yeah. But at the very least, if we set up a server that is serving image segments, we can also make it serve up metadata like this.
Yeah, I can remember, well, it's been a while ago since I was sort of active in the Squeak development community, but I know we did put some attention into changing methods and how to deal with those changes, partly to warn you and partly to actually convert. And I don't know if it would, for something like Squeak Pages, I could imagine a sort of a blessed series of Squeak images, the 5.0, 5.1, 5.2, and between those, there could be general purpose conversion things that would handle most of such problems. But I don't know. It may be that, a more general theoretical solution is the one to go with. I think, just as Gilad mentioned, it'd be nice to just to get the thing off the ground, to just pick one and get that to work. And then we could do a bunch of these experiments bridging off from there.
Mm-hmm. Well, one example of what worked very well is your Squeak update scheme. That still works to this day, right? You go to any image, you click update, it's still there, it's still working. So
that's great. Yes. Yeah.
So
yes.
Obviously,
yeah.
Yeah. Actually, it's the only update mechanism we use in Quiz for the base image. We don't use Monticello. We only use your update. And it works perfectly well still.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I thought that you used JIT to update the image or something.
No, we use a JIT. I think it was meant to be used to store text files. That's it. All the clever stuff is done by the image, not by JIT. I mean, when you pull a rep, bring all the updates. Okay, the updates we don't load via HTTP. They are in a local folder. So when you pull the repo, you get all the update files, and then in Quiz you go load updates, and it has the latest update number, or the same as it was in. And you, the only identification you need for an update that was loaded. That's it.
Speaking of Quiz as an example, would it be easy to bridge across these? I mean, I guess it could all be done from Quiz, and then you'd have the same problem with versions of Quiz. I don't know how much experience do you have with moving things back and forth between Quiz and some given Squeak release?
Well, what I have done many times is to bring interesting code and fixes and updates from Squeak, and a bit also from Faro into the quiz world.
Yeah.
But I never tried to do that in an automatic way. I mean, the way I like to work is when I adapt some code, I make it mine. Okay, so the moment I bring code from Squeak or from Faro or from anywhere, it's a fork, and
Yeah.
from I'm responsible for it. I that's the way that is safest for me, and I only want to have code that I at least I can try to understand. Okay, mastery principle. I everything, but in theory it should be able to. I haven't that much interoperability between dialects. But for example, in Quiz, I did write plugins. So I have all the VM Maker stuff, not to run the simulation because it uses Squeak Morphic, but to build plugins. So I can code in Slang and generate C and do all the stuff needed to do VM plugins from Quiz. It don't work much on VM Maker. I just brought it into our repo and it works essentially.
Mhm.
So if you ever want to try some specific problem or example, I will always be willing to help you. Can, of course, count on
Yeah.
that.
Well, that'd be great. Other comments or suggestions about that, or anything else for that matter?
Well, I'm going to reiterate that you want to keep it simple because this actually is a bottomless problem, and the thing that you have that actually works is probably what you should do, and really not worry about the all these questions. They're endless. This versioning and syncing, and it really is a big deal, and you could be waylaid for a long time. I mean, figuring out the one true way to do this or something.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, your original idea, just make it so that you can actually bring in stuff the way Lively does it, I guess, is probably the most something you can do almost immediately.
Mhm.
That I really think that's the way you should look at it. My 2 cents.
Maybe I can put my 2 cents in there too. So I agree with Gilad, absolutely. But still, I mean, apart from this, there is still the problem of cross operability of Smalltalks. And I think it's a worthwhile project to somehow find ways to use software from one Smalltalk in another one. And I think with my translation thingy, it's at least a practical way to do it. I mean, you have to code for all target system and stuff, the translations by hand, but still you have it versioned, you have it repeatable, you have it measurable, and all this stuff, all this manual porting business goes away, and it's more an engineering issue, and that's a good thing, I think. So this could work not only between dialects, but also between versions of one dialect, I believe. So you declare the changes, what have changed between one state and the other.
Mhm.
So you just declare it and then you execute it. But the declaration is simple, repeatable, declarative. It's just there. So it's not a process, it's a description. Okay, but it's not there, right? So just an idea. I think instead of unifying all Smalltalks to the same language kind of thing is futile. I think we should more try to move things much easier from code base to code base. 2 cents.
Well, Yeah. So if we get something simple working, and if people get enthusiastic and write a bunch of things in it, then we'll have this little pile of test data that we can then do all these meta things on. Get it to file, get it to load that project in this other small tool. Just that and the other. They would be sort of fun and motivating, in addition to checking out whatever basic mechanism we come up with.
In particular, if you are thinking about Squeak pages and morphic worlds and projects, this is quite a challenge to make compatible Quiz and Squeak, because morphic is the part that I change the most. Okay, the geometry is completely different.
That's right.
It's more like self. I remember that in his interview in Squeak News, Sean Maloney said that in self, morphic use relative coordinates, and when he moved to Squeak, he made them up. And he thought it would be good to make them relative again. And that has started my interest in this kind of things.
Yeah.
So what I did is to make them relative, and that's what makes it possible to make each morph have a different scale factor, okay? Because it has its own geometry. So and all that is in floating point. Perhaps I'm in more detail, but that means that coding your own morphs is quite different in also the vector graphics morphic canvas has a different than the bitplit based, of course. It offers different services.
Yep.
And also has this trick I did, that it has a parallel display like object that instead of pixels holds morph IDs. So when you grab something with the hand, it doesn't need it's there or not, which can be very complicated for arbitrary vector graphics, right? Then the framework already knows, because it has essentially a display of pointers to morphs. So you click on a pixel and it asks what morph is there, and it just grabs it. And that uses a lot of memory, but memory is cheap today, and makes programming much easier. I remember the first efforts to do vector graphic stuff in Squeak with Balloon for example. Then every morph had to do its own geometry twice, one for drawing and another one for hit by to check for a pixel. That is not needed in Quiz. But it also means that moving code morphs from one dialect to the other will be harder. The APIs are already quite different.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
But it could be possible to port the morphic 3 because self is morphic 1, Squeak is morphic 2, and now Quiz with vector graphics is morphic 3. That could also be ported to Squeak. Why not? It can perfectly be made.
Right. Gilad, did you put your hand up? You're muted. Gilad, you're muted.
Okay, so now I'm unmuted, but really all this was just to say that no, I didn't raise my hand. I was just waving to my wife who was leaving, and so that's all.
Yeah, fine. Yeah. Yeah, well, I've about the different ways of doing transformations. That's the same thing that I did with Lively Kernel, because it's what's supported in the in all the web.
You also have one transformation in each morph.
Yeah.
So it's the same as Quiz.
Yeah.
Cool. Right. It's nicer.
Yes, and especially on top of what exists in the browsers. Yep.
Cool.
Yeah, well, that requires a little bit of thinking about.
So this is Smalltalk's one of Smalltalk's perennial problems, right? And I think it's inherent, right? It attracts creative people, and therefore you have an excess of creativity, right? You get these forks, you get variations, all of which are interesting, as opposed to something more mundane where there's a really one standard version, and it's easier to manage that way. But yeah, I mean, undertaking like, oh, could you unify all these dialects again into a single Smalltalk? That on one hand seems really interesting, on the other hand is probably not very feasible for all kinds of reasons. So maybe for now you want to get like Squeak.js to support these pages, and people who want to have something similar can adapt it if
Yep.
it takes off.
Yeah.
Yep. And I can see, if you can get people to agree that it makes sense to have, like the original Smalltalk projects, where each project could have a different way of doing graphics. I mean, then I could see, just like MVC and Morphic lived together in early Squeak, you could have another thing that had MVC, Morphic 1, 2, and 3 all living together in different worlds.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, in the very early days of what is Quizmorphic, the people from Faro asked me if it was possible to run the stuff I was doing in Faro. So I did exactly that, Craig. It was a new kind of project. It wasn't an MVC project or a Morphic project. It was a, how was it called? I guess it was called Light Widget project that was not compatible with the rest of the Morse and stuff.
Yeah.
It was a different kind, just like MVC. That was maybe 12 or 13 years ago, and it was abandoned shortly after. But it is possible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And still, that's better than having all the different groups of creative people going off and, being more separated.
Yep.
But I would say that this going in different directions is from when Smalltalk came about. I think all languages from back then, Pascal split into pieces, Lisp, Forth, everybody split into pieces. It's just from the 90s on that you got languages where there's essentially one version of that language. So I'm not sure that it's the nature of Smalltalk. It's just when it happened.
Besides, it's not the language, right? The language is essentially the same. The difference is the libraries. And of course, libraries evolve. In any language, libraries evolve. You have standard C, but how many variations of libraries doing similar things you have for C?
Yeah.
An infinite number.
A few, how many years ago, I don't know, but some people tried to create a successor to ANSI Smalltalk standard, to create a new Smalltalk standard. So I joined the mailing list, and I tried to convince them that the best way to do that would be to have a really, really tiny kernel, and then everything else would be implemented as code rather than having text saying, oh, you have to have such a class and it has to return that. Why have text? You supply the rest in terms of, it's the equivalent of, I forgot the name of the classes, the tool builder classes. So the idea is that if you use tool builder, then it doesn't matter if you're running on Morphic or MVC or Tweak or whatever. Your little tool, I mean, it's not, you always lose stuff when you have these intermediate layers, but at least you get a little functionality that works on all these app platforms. So I said, yeah, why don't we define a really, really tiny Smalltalk, and then the rest you supply code that everybody can load into their particular Dolphin, Smalltalk, or Visual Works or whatever. But everybody hated this idea. They really, really hated it. So the standard didn't go anywhere, so it really didn't matter. But
There's a problem. There's a problem with that. The syntax. So most of the Smalltalks now have different syntax elements which are not read by the others. So if in order to extend a language like that, you need to provide also a new parser and compiler and all of this kind of stuff. Decompiler. This is a nightmare. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is feasible, really.
It was only recently that I finally saw a formal grammar for Smalltalk, and it didn't come from a standards committee. It came from a enthusiastic member of the community who figured it out.
So there have been grammars for Smalltalk, for something small like Smalltalk, depending what you want to be the definitive or supposedly definitive grammar, for a very long time. The thing is that the classic Smalltalk, most Smalltalks, beyond the method level, they just don't use a grammar, right? And here your library incompatibility immediately manifests because you can't even load a class in some cases if essentially the API for class is ever so slightly different. And so the expression that defines the class in like doits and so forth may be incompatible, right? So at a minimum, having a syntax for, okay, what is a Smalltalk class should be relatively non-controversial, I would hope.
Yeah, well, I was just talking about the BNF for what is a method. What are the production rules to make a method? I never saw that until about a year ago.
Well, there's the railroad diagrams, right, in the original, right? And
yeah, those aren't enough. Yeah, you can't make a compiler with those.
Sure. Well, you can turn them into a compiler fairly easily. I mean,
well, I just did it, and I started with that, and it was not nearly enough. It turns out, like Peter Lount called him out last time. I didn't know who actually did it because it was this anonymous PDF I found, but he told us last month that it was Alan Lovejoy who finally, wrote out all the production rules that you could actually make a working compiler from, and I made one a month ago. I've been using that to transpile between Sista and the earlier Squeak instruction sets, and I'm going to be generating WebAssembly from it also.
Yeah, even inside the single Squeak image, you have methods that allow underscore or the left arrow, and other ones that have colon equals. So it can be messy.
Well, you should be able to get over that. You just transform them once and for all and say that, it's done. This really is a relic.
Until you go to some web page and download some code from before you made that decision.
Well, it's just one more alternation in your ENF.
No, I know it's a little detail, and now Juan allows Unicode. You have 8 left arrows if you want.
Yeah.
Well, right now you can use any mathematical symbol for binary operators, but but not for assignment. I didn't modify the parser for that. It could be
that word already lost.
I don't think it's a good idea. It would make it even this today. Still, I dissent a little bit with what you all were talking. I think that is the biggest issue. I think we could come up with a tax, and Gilad, as you say, don't rely any longer on message creation, on messages, sorry. But just use some syntax, at least in addition to what each dialect already has. And that would not be too hard to do. Craig, as you know, you've been doing harder stuff if you are going to WebAssembly, right? The libraries are different. We could do something like Tool Builder, but Jessel, it would not be for everyone. It would be only for those who are happy enough with the intersection of the functionality of all the dialects. So for some tools, it could be for non-user interface code. it would be no problem. And for tools that have simple enough user interfaces, it can be done too. But for applications that want to take advantage of the peculiarities or idiosyncrasies of some dialect, that will not scale. So it's just a common set of the libraries that can be standardized. And we could do that with an API like Tool Builder. I don't think the problem is that doing this, the syntax, or a tool builder like API, like Grease was at some point. I don't think the problem is that these are things that are too hard to do. I think the issue is that nobody is interested enough in them in order to invest a few months of work. 2-3 months of full-time work by one person on each dialect, and this can be done. I have done harder things than that, and I guess most of us have too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I was thinking about if you go to this page, and obviously I'm running Squeak.js as a JavaScript. What if I inverted it? First of all, it brings in the image segment or whatever we call it. And that has in the header what image you used to create it.
Yes.
Then it brings that, and then it loads. So you invert the order. Instead of bringing in the Squeak image or the QE's image or whatever, and then that bring in the segment, the segment would pull in the image that created it, and then you don't need compatibility unless you need to combine two projects. But in theory, every page would have one thing. I mean, you show it might have multiple morphs or whatever, but it's just one little project. You don't have a project that this one was created in Quiz and this one was created in Squeak, and you have to mash them on a page. That's where you need the compatibility we're talking about. If you don't, if the segment knows which, then you don't have that problem that I was talking about, having to adapt classes, because you load the exact image that you need, and it can be Quiz, it can be Squeak, it can be Feral or something else.
Yeah.
Yep. And that's just, you just have to patch Squeak.js to allow that, to given a segment, look inside of it, then get the image, then put it.
Yep.
Yeah. It's a little bit of metadata in the map of projects, right?
Well, you'd have a map of the project would be pointed directly in the HTML of the page. It's the image that then you have to somehow find it. It has to be in a way, in some place that doesn't go away, some place that so it has to be a well-known image somewhere. I mean,
yeah,
maybe some as a file name extension, right? .squeak dot whatever segment, and that's it.
Yeah, so the first thing that loads is Squeak.js itself, which is a JavaScript program.
Yes, of course, it needs to recognize the extension or that part of the file name to choose whatever image it needs to load. But it should, the format of the image segments should not be modified for that. That's why I say it's metadata. It's in the file name or in a separate JSON or whatever, not inside the image segment, because otherwise, I think that would be harder to do and more complicated to make it interoperable, and everybody agree on that. I don't know.
No, since the link is somewhere in HTML, you might even have it as a HTML parameter. So the name is that, and the image it needs is that. I mean, HTML allows you to have a bunch of optional parameters. I don't know how you encode that in the HTML.
Yeah.
So basically what you're saying is you want a loader, and the loader can be in the extreme be the original image that created the image which created the page, right?
Yeah,
But
the
it could be
idea
a
is,
figure loader too. If you have the image already, I mean, in the right version, you just pull in just the diffs.
Yeah, as long as the that meta information doesn't get separated from the image segment, because inevitably someone will expect it to work where it was never intended to work if that information isn't obvious,
yeah,
or missing.
So once we have this all running and everybody's having fun with it, where do we put the projects that people save so easily? And to sort of foster a good creative community. I mean, what we did in Lively is we have a server, and it goes to the server, and we pay for that. And if you do separate installs, then they go there. So I don't know if people had experience with that kind of level of this.
Well, like squeak.js.org is a GitHub Pages thing, which as a GitHub action just creates the website. So it could be fun to commit, project image segments to that repository and have them just become part of the web page as a result of doing that. I think that's just a matter of having permission to do it from Vanessa or whomever owns the GitHub repo in question. You might not be able to rebuild the website as often as you would like, but maybe often enough.
Yeah, that seems like a good place to start.
Well,
it will be interesting to see.
Right, if people can save their pages, right? If people can save their pages and the URI encodes like image and image segment, and they just give you a URI and they can host it wherever, it's not clear that you need to have administer a central site for these things.
Yeah, that's true also. It would just be nice to have one reliable, memorable place in addition.
I see what you're saying, Gilad. Yes.
Yeah. That's another thing I like about Dino, another JavaScript runtime, is it sort of declared the Node.js centralized, module repository system to be more trouble than it was worth. And so built into it fundamentally is the idea that you can import JavaScript functions from files hosted on any website anywhere very easily. You don't have to think about NPM or anything like that.
Still, if you wanted to do the GitHub pages, to check if it is possible to give public write access, but only for pushing new files. Anyone can contribute, but cannot break what others did. Otherwise, people would need to request permission or do pull request and wait until somebody accepts them. It will be way more complicated. If there's a way, perhaps a different Git repo, not in GitHub, if GitHub doesn't let you do that, where it can have public access, but only for new files.
Yeah. Probably would be most cleanly done as just a separate repository. And the two of them just know about each other.
Yeah.
Well, among the reasons why Scratch became so much more popular than eToys was that there was a central site where everybody saved their projects. Whereas eToys was kind of spread out among, to find eToy stuff, you'd have to search the web. And there was some at some university, then there was a squeakland.org, and there was this and that. Whereas Scratch was the MIT guys hosting it. They had, 1 million projects, even though most of them were not really high quality projects, but yeah.
Yeah. Although a scheme where there's very smooth search engine optimization done so that the system itself can easily do searches and find stuff for you to load. That could be nice.
Yeah, and I think Scratch got some mileage also out of the sort of social aspect of recognizing people who built on other stuff. And we probably want to put a little bit of attention into that.
Yeah, nice. It can be done. Yeah.
Well, that's the idea.
Cool.
So
Well,
Craig
I'm
and I,
into it.
yeah, Craig and I have at least committed to spending a bit of time on it, and we we intend to use whatever arm twisting is available on Vanessa. She was certainly enthusiastic. So
Yeah.
And we'll give a 5-minute report at the next meeting.
Cool.
Well, shall we throw it open to open conversation?
Yep. I think that's where we are.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, I'll be back in a minute.
Okay. Well, I'll stay here until Craig's back, and then I think I have to take off. But this has been useful conversation, and I especially, Juan, I'm glad that you were in on this conversation because I want to do what we can to make things work in your environment. And
I'd be honored and happy to help. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, this idea of sort of the indirection on the image being used is good.
Yeah.
It's a very hard problem. I mean, I showed at the beginning what I was working on in 1984. And back then, most people didn't have hard disks yet on their computers. So they just put in a floppy was the application, a floppy was the data, run it, and then it was gone. So I thought, well, the problem with this Smalltalk thing here is that you then have to file in. You have your image, and your friend has an image, and they have a little application that they like, let's say a little clock in the corner. They have to file it out, and then now file it in, and now there are two copies of that clock on the disk, and their image and my image, and it's too complicated. I don't think that people will go for that. And I was completely wrong about that. Eventually, people started to get hard disks, and then they started to install applications. Now, most people still don't understand this thing about installing applications. I deal with people who are not very computer savvy, and somebody will come and install stuff for them. For example, I know a lot of people who can't, take a PC computer that doesn't have Office in it and get Office to work. So, but they do it. I mean, they accept that you have to, you just can't put in a floppy disk, and whatever is in that floppy disk is suddenly on your screen. And so I spent a lot of time back then trying to figure out a way to have the image deal with these things, these little separate things. And the people, and I got to use the Smalltalk V and Smalltalk V for Windows. And that was a reasonably good experience. So the Smalltalk V, you started out with a tiny little file called v.exe. And that was your image. Now, the bulk of the actual image was in a bunch of DLL files. So there was a DLL file that had the compiler, the DLL that had the magnitude, collections, whatever. So these were in these DLLs. that your v.exe called. But initially, your v.exe was like 7 kilobytes long, whatever. And then you started playing around, and everything that you did from now on was added to the v.exe. So it grew and grew. But it had only, you didn't have to extract your application later on to give it to somebody else. You just gave them your .vxe in a subset of the DLLs. The license told you which DLLs you could distribute and which ones you couldn't. So that was the license from Digitalk. So there were like 5 DLLs, and these 3 you could distribute, and these 2 you couldn't. So that anybody that received your application could run it, but could not develop. They had to buy from Digitalk the development environment. But my point is that so that's sort of where my idea came from. So of having the segment point back to the image. So you had these v.exe pointing back to the DLLs.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very crude, but it did work. I mean, so if something was done once and it worked, you can do it again.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, folks, in my time zone, it's a little bit late, and I need to leave. Thank you, everyone, for this very nice meeting.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Yep. I think I'm going to go also, and I'm glad you were here, and thanks everybody for your comments.
Yeah.
We'll try and make some out of it.
Cool.
Ciao,
Ciao.
everybody.
Bye.
Thanks everyone.
All right.
Okay, well, gotta head off too. See ya.